We'll begin, inshallah. I wanted to start today first by acknowledging that I think all of us have a lot on our minds these last few days. All of us are very concerned. I know, first of all, about the ongoing troubles that our brothers and sisters in the Muslim world are undergoing and have been undergoing for a long time. But then the last few days with the terrible turn of events in Egypt has made us all very troubled. And there's just one point I want to make, which is that the reality is maybe I can. Do you need some help with the number? Okay. What number is Arabi on? What is it? 3? So Arabi is thalatha, if you need it. Okay. A point I want to make is that it's very valuable to study history, Islamic history. And I don't mean ending history at the Khilafah of Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib. I mean to continue to study the history of the Muslims, and really the history of humanity generally. Because what we find is that at every time in human history there's some turmoil. And there is trouble, there is war, there is an overturning of governments, there is oppression. At every time in history, someone is going through some hardship. This is not to minimize what anyone is going through today, whether that's in Mosul or Syria or elsewhere. Just a minute, I'm going to wait till people can settle down a little bit. I can't talk when other people are talking, so I'll just wait. I can't do anything about the bird. Okay. I'm very distractible, so if anyone's talking to their friend, it'll distract me. One of the things that, when I wrote my book on the Quran, one of the things that I found very interesting was tracing the names in the ijazah, in the certificate for the Quran reciters and memorizers, for the huffaz and the qurra of the Quran. When I traced their names in the history books and then looked up in the biographical dictionaries known as the tabaqat books in Arabic, when I looked up their life stories, I was amazed to see how each one of these great scholars lived through so much trouble. Almost every one of them was a refugee at one point or another in his or her life, had to flee from one army or another army, had to flee from one oppressive ruler or another oppressive ruler under the threat of imprisonment, and many of them were imprisoned. But what's amazing is how they continued to work, how they continue to do their work of teaching the Quran, teaching Hadith, teaching Sharia, teaching Islam, wherever they were, until there's a story in my book, for those of you who will be able to read it, of the great scholar Muhammad ibn al-Jazari. Many of you, if you've studied the Quran and have an ijaza in tajweed, one of the things that you would study when you learn tajweed is the rules of tajweed from a little book called Al-Jazariyah. Al-Jazariyah is named after Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Jazari. Muhammad ibn al-Jazari was in the army with the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I. This is during the 9th century Hijri, the 15th century of the Common Era. He was with his army when Timur, the Mongol Timur, beat Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara, Ankara. And he was taken as a prisoner of war. So here he was, a prisoner of war in the camp of the Mongols. And what did he do? What did Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Jazari do? He kept teaching. He kept teaching. He kept teaching Quran. He kept teaching the qira'at of the Quran. He gave certificates, ijazat. He kept teaching all of the subjects, even while he was a prisoner of war. So my point to you is that we need to know what's happening with our brothers and sisters in the world. We need to help them to the extent that we can. We need to make dua for them. But we can't become paralyzed by what's happening and not continue to learn and grow. Because everywhere there will be some upheaval. And the amazing thing about this religion is that it continues. It continues despite all of these difficulties. And one of the reasons is, the main reason is that the Muslims have had faith that the continuation of Islam does not depend on any person. It does not depend on any group of people. It does not depend on any nation of people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who protects this religion. Allah will raise the people He needs, men and women, to preserve this religion and continue it. So we shouldn't despair, and we shouldn't become paralyzed or frozen. We should pray for our brothers and sisters, help them to the extent we can, but we have to focus on building our communities and on continuing to educate ourselves and our children. And this is the way that this religion will continue, and this is all we're responsible for doing. We're responsible only for what's in our hands. The rest is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So inshallah, Allah will help us to be able to be wise, to have wisdom in understanding what our responsibility is wherever we are, and to benefit from any peace and security that we enjoy, to use it in the right way. When so many people do not have peace and security today, we are very blessed to be able to sit here in this environment, alhamdulillah. So we need to take advantage of that. We need to benefit from it and be grateful and learn. Now today the topic we're discussing is men and women in Islam, brothers and sisters in faith. And I want us to first think about why this is important. Now, we may have different ideas about why this topic is important. Some of you may think this is important because there are many people who have misconceptions, many non-Muslims who have misunderstandings or misconceptions about women in Islam. In fact, probably the greatest criticism we hear about Islam is the position of women in Islam, or how Muslim women are treated. We hear this all of the time. And we hear so many false statements and incorrect statements. And this isn't something new. This is not something new. In fact, it's the continuation of a very, very long historical tradition of attacking Islam and Muslims through women in Islam. There's a wonderful book, or a wonderful observation by a scholar named Leila Ahmed, who's at Harvard University in the United States, who pointed out that when the British colonialists were in Egypt, and the colonial administrator was Lord Cromer, that when Lord Cromer was in Egypt, he justified colonial occupation of Egypt by saying that the English were enlightened people, and they had a better understanding of the dignity of woman and how to respect women, and that justified the violent occupation of Egypt by the English. Now what's interesting is that Lord Cromer himself, back home in England, was the president of an organization whose only mission, whose only goal was to prevent women from being able to vote in England. So at that time there was a new movement on the part of English women wanting to be able to vote because they were, the word is disenfranchisement, they were not allowed to vote. So there's this women's movement demanding that they would be treated equally and have the vote. This Lord Cromer back in England was not just a member, but in fact was the president of the organization to prevent English women from voting. Yet, here he was arguing that it was Islam that oppresses women. This is the hypocrisy, the nifaq, of this kind of discourse. Not only that, because Lord Cromer came from England at a time when it was in what we call the Victorian era. During this time period, the idea about women was that women are very delicate, women are very fragile, women are very weak. This was the British cultural model of women, and that's why women should be treated, very, very carefully, and that they should not do any heavy work. They should not see anything that was disturbing, because that women's mental health was very imbalanced. Women were weak, mentally weak, and if they got too emotional, they could become hysterical, meaning they could lose their mind. This was the British idea. So when Lord Cromer came to England, he found, what did he find? He found that there was an Egyptian woman's medical school, and he was shocked. Because, according to his own English Victorian culture, medicine was not a suitable occupation for women because women were too weak to be able to handle, images of blood and to conduct surgery, that this could lead them to being emotionally unstable. And so he closed down the women's medical school, the Egyptian women's medical school. Yet he was saying he came to Egypt to liberate women. This is at the beginning of the 19th century. So what I'm saying is that we have faced as Muslims this kind of discourse for many centuries. There's a great deal of hypocrisy that occurs when the people who attack Islam talk about the position of women in Islam. And we need to be able to recognize that hypocrisy. At the same time, we also need to be honest and recognize that in every society, the group of people that historically has been oppressed the most are women. This is true in every culture and in every civilization. Every culture and every civilization. And until today, there are very few societies, maybe no society, that really lives up to its own ideals about the position of women in that society. That until now, we see that that women tend to be vulnerable to abuse and victimization. That when the economy in countries goes down, it is women who often are the first ones who are victimized, having to turn to prostitution and other degrading forms of work in order to support themselves. It is true that any country that is engaged in warfare, one of the universal techniques of fighting the enemy is to rape their women. So rape in war is a common and universal phenomenon. And it occurs everywhere. We see in Syria it is prevalent now. So the situation of women are often and always vulnerable unless they're empowered by society and by to really protect themselves, to know how to protect themselves, and society has an ethic about the dignity and respect towards women. Unfortunately, we have seen that, of course, Muslims are also human beings. There are Muslims who are very pious and righteous and great people. There are also Muslims who are criminals. We have jails in every country. There are jails in Muslim societies. There are Muslims who beat their wives, who abuse their wives. Why not? They're human beings. And it doesn't mean that Islam justifies this. It doesn't mean that it happens more among Muslims than others. But it does happen. And Muslims do that, just as there are Muslims who are murderers, there are Muslims who are crooks and will steal your money. Islam, just because Islam exists or someone is born into a Muslim family, doesn't mean that they're a good person. Even during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there were people, there were Muslims who lived in the community of Medina, who had the benefit of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam living with them, and they committed zina, they drank alcohol, and they did other things that were wrong. And we know, one of the things we know about them is that there were munafiqun, that there were hypocrites, those who appeared to be Muslim but were not. So we should not be so defensive if there's a Muslim who does something wrong. We should not take it personally. We should not feel that this necessarily reflects on the whole Muslim community. There are criminals in every community. The question is, what is our response to their criminality? What is our response to their harm? We will be blamed only if we don't respond properly to someone who is committing violence or someone who is oppressing another, whether that's a man or a woman. That is where we will be to blame. We aren't responsible for what other people do, but we are responsible for how we deal with those people. And that is where very often in our community, we're not rising to the challenge enough. We need to do more. And especially when it comes to family situations, naturally all of us are reluctant to be involved in anyone else's business, anyone's family business, in the relationship between a husband and wife. But especially when we are a minority in a country where there are not a lot of Muslims, we have greater responsibilities. Study after study has shown that immigrant women from any community are more vulnerable to domestic violence. What do I mean by domestic violence? I mean husbands beating their wives, right? Immigrant women are more susceptible to domestic violence than others. Why? Primarily because they're away from their family, If you're in the country where you have brothers and uncles and relatives, your family will intervene if your husband is not treating you well. Most normal families will be that way. But if a woman comes to another country, she has no family around her to give her husband advice or to keep watch over him. If she doesn't know the language, she doesn't know who to turn to. She also feels embarrassed because she's a Muslim and she doesn't want non-Muslims to see what her business is. Who is going to be the defender of that woman? Who is going to help that woman? That's why the Islamic centers, the masajid, our communities have a greater responsibility in this country than in Muslim majority countries. We have to be like an extended family. And that means you are a brother. As a man, you are a brother not just to other men, but to the women in those communities. And you need to look at those women as your sisters. Just as if your sister was being abused by her husband, would you stand by and say, oh, it's not my business? No, you would stop it. So we need to be able to understand that there are serious challenges and that there's a greater responsibility to being a Muslim in this country than in other places. We have more leisure time, we have more education. Do we think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave that to us only so we could just enjoy ourselves? No. With every benefit, with every blessing comes a responsibility. So we need to understand where we live. We need to understand our context and how it is the same and how it's different from other countries, and really rise up to this challenge. And we should remember that this is not only a benefit, when we talk about these issues, we're not only talking about helping women, It's not like it's some sadaqah that we're doing towards women. When it is dhulm, when it is oppression, there's a responsibility to intervene, not only for the madloom. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Unsur akhak, help your brother, zaliman aw madluman, whether he is an oppressor or is being oppressed." So if he's a zalim is the person who's doing the harm. Madloom is the person being harmed. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he said this, his companions were confused. They said, of course we know how to help the person who's being oppressed. We're going to go to that person's side. But how do we help the zalim? How do you help the zalim? The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, by stopping him from continuing his oppression. So if you allow someone to continue harming someone other, what are we saying? Go ahead and sin. Go ahead, continue in sin. Gather your sins until the day of judgment you meet your Creator. Is this love for our brother? Do we love our brother when we allow him to continue in a behavior that's sinful? Isn't it more loving to our brother to stop him? Even if we have to grab him by his shoulders and say, you have to stop this because what you're doing is wrong. And we're not going to let you do this anymore. You're hurting not only someone else, you're hurting yourself. Because on the day of judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask you about this behavior. So we need to understand we have that responsibility. We do not live in a society where anyone else is going to be involved. And if we don't get involved, sooner or later, some people are going to go out of the community. And they're going to say, I was being oppressed, I was being harmed, I was being hurt, and I told the people in my community, I told my father-in-law, I told my brother-in-law, I told the imam, I told the sheikh, and they did nothing. They said, sister, have patience. And I can't have patience when I'm being threatened, when my children are being threatened. This is not a case for patience. It is not taqwa to allow yourself to be a victim. Do we tell a man who's being beaten, oh, mashallah, have some patience, have taqwa, it's okay, Allah will reward you? No, you have to stop. You have not only a right but a responsibility to stop this person from hurting you. So sometimes we hear stories and we see women on the news and they say Islam encourages or allows or permits men to beat their wives. Islam permits men to treat their wives like inferior. Islam allows men to control their daughters in a way where they can't enjoy education and have opportunities. Some of these stories are true. Some of them are true. And unfortunately, sometimes they did have people who said to them, no, in Islam you have to be patient. In Islam you have to put up with this. So we have to realize that when something that is an attack on Islam or a scandal against Muslims, someone comes in the public and talks about something in the Muslim community and attacks Muslims and even Islam for the treatment of women, honestly, when we see that, sometimes we should say astaghfirullah, because sometimes this is the result of our own neglect. We have not done enough to prevent this situation or to deal with this situation. When we found out about it, we didn't do enough. And it doesn't mean that some of those people are not attention-seeking. Yeah, there are some people who go on TV, they want attention, they want to sell a book, they want to be famous. But that doesn't deny the fact that there are also innocent victims that we haven't done enough about. Now, I don't want to say that we're completely negligent. There are so many good Muslim men and women in our community who are doing everything they can. And they help everyone who turns to them. And when they know that something's happening, they help. But it's not enough simply to be passive and respond to a situation. We need to, in a very rational way, in a logical and scientific way, develop systems and procedures to deal with these situations and to educate the community. In medicine, for example, half the people in this country would be sick if all we did is treat people when they got sick. Medicine involves educating people about how not to get sick. We give them vaccinations. We tell them to eat healthy, nutritious food. We tell them about cleanliness and hygiene so they don't get sick. If we don't do any education and we only wait for the trouble to happen, we'll be overwhelmed. And this is what many of us find. Because we haven't done enough education, because we haven't done enough prevention, we end up being overwhelmed with so many problems. Because we have a lot of sickness in our community. So this is why we have to take responsibility to be more active, to create workshops, to use the khutbah, which is a golden opportunity every Friday to educate the community, to have people within our community who understand how to deal with social services when there is a problem like this. So we need to be more active.